When a democracy is intact, it strengthens the people. It protects and fights for fundamental freedoms, individual rights. It's a fight for order against chaos. It strengthens. On the other hand, democracy, incredibly fragile. It will only be as strong as our willingness to fight for it. And right now, there are many forces that are attempting to purposely, I believe, weaken our democracy.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris speaking on the fate of our democracy. She sat down with the Reverend Al Sharpton, who'll join us in just a moment to discuss the ongoing fight for racial justice and equality. This past Friday marked the third anniversary of President Biden selecting Harris as his running mate. And you wouldn't know it from her relentlessly negative press coverage, but ever since then, she's been Biden's political secret weapon, particularly the last year and a half on social and cultural issues such as abortion. As the New York Times notes, Harris has taken on a new forceful role in the Biden-Harris reelect. Joining me now, Molly Jong-Fast, special correspondent for Vanity Fair and host of the Fast Politics podcast, and the Reverend Al Sharpton, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, founder and president of the National Action Network, and author of Righteous Troublemakers, Untold Stories of the Social Justice Movement in America. Rev, you got the interview, so I'm starting with you. What were your biggest takeaways from your sit-down with the vice president?
My biggest takeaways, I wanted to talk with her, and it was a long interview. We showed half of it last night on Politics Nation. We'll show the other half 2 weeks from now, the day of the March on Washington. I wanted to sit with her to talk about 60 years after the March on Washington of Dr. King, I Have a Dream. How does she see where we are now as we get ready, Martin King III, Andre Waters King, and I leading this march Saturday after next? And she said she's fearing about democracy. We've seen in our lifetime the erosion of many of the rights that we had 60 years ago. Waters King talks about how her daughter, the only grandchild of Martin Luther King, has less rights growing up than we had. Women's right to choose is gone. The right is being eroded in many states. Hate crimes are up for blacks, gays, and Jews. So that's why we're having this march. I wanted to talk to her about it. And I was struck up, because I've known the vice president a long time, at the passion and the real commitment that she had to really fighting this back. She said, this is not just about an election. It's about whether we're going to have a democracy or an autocracy. If they get away with lessening our vote and weakening our vote, then we are in an autocratic state, and we lose.
And Rev, as you just mentioned, you spoke to her about the march. You've got your T-shirt there, the 60th March anniversary of the March on Washington.
I've got one for you.
Oh, good. I'll take it in a small. I'll be aspirational. But how did the March on Washington, that moment in history, make her rise possible?
I think that when you saw tens of thousands of people in Washington, of all labor, blacks, one of the great rabbis made one of the great speeches that day. And of course, Dr. King with I Have a Dream and the leading civil rights group. That said to the Congress that, wait a minute, there's a mass following here. There's going to be problems in my own state in terms of my vote. You got to show marching doesn't solve a problem. It dramatizes the problem to make people do something. And don't forget that impact helped to energize 63. We got the 64 Civil Rights Act and then the 65 Voting Rights Act. If you can't show mass support, people in the Congress and the Senate will not do anything because they do not see the threat.
Right, and that's an excellent point, Rev. Marching only does one part of the process. Molly, you and I, what is that, 6 months ago now, had separate interviews with the vice president on the same day in the same office where Rev did his interview. And I bring that up to get your perspective between then and now, because we've seen the vice president really in action. She flew to Florida and sparred with Governor DeSantis over Florida's new curriculum on slavery. She also flew to Iowa to defend abortion rights. Talk about how important her role is to the Biden ticket.
So she has been everywhere. She's been to Florida about the African American AP courses. She was there also before about abortion. I mean, she has been quick to jump on a plane and give a very passionate and very good speech. And I think she's been amazing. And I think that the reason that she has had such a tough time is because there is so much racism and so much sexism, and it's so pervasive and it's so baked in to our mainstream media and to our society as a whole that she cannot get a fair shake. And I really think that you see, even in the framing, even when people think they are giving her the benefit of the doubt, they are not. And you see this, and you see this is a problem that a lot of women and a lot of women of color who are in politics have, and it's incredibly unfair, and it's what keeps a lot of women from running, and it's just it's like one of the great tragedies of our modern time.
Well, Molly, let's talk a little bit more about that, because I was about to ask you, I'm just wondering, do you think Vice President Harris is being unfairly criticized because she's the first woman and first woman of color in the role of vice president?
Yes, and I think that women of color have it 10 times harder than anyone else. I think that the coverage they get is uniquely unfair. I think that even when journalists think they are being unbiased, they have a bias that is so innate and hard to parse that it affects the coverage even when they think it doesn't. I think that there's so much racism and sexism in our culture, and it's so baked in, and it's so hard for people to see that even people who think they're not doing it and who think they are, not biased, they have that problem. And you see it again and again. And look at Black women politicians have absolutely the hardest time. And, if you think about how few Black senators we've had and how few Black women senators we've had, and if you look at the House, I mean, it's just the treatment is different, the writing is different, the titles are different, the framing is different. It's just such a pervasive problem, and it's so hard to parse. And I think it is really terrible.
Molly Jong-Fast and Reverend Al Sharpton, more of your interview will air around the time of the march. Thank you both with the interview with the Vice President. Thank you both very much for coming to the Sunday Show.